My name is Jonathan Albright. I work at Columbia University Tao Center for Digital Journalism, and I'm going to speak about how to map ecosystems of fake news and understand the role of propaganda and misinformation beyond content. Hello, I'd just like to thank everyone for bringing me to Buenos Aires. It's been an exciting trip, so it's been a long way, but I think the best thing about coming here is there's no time zone difference. Everywhere I fly in the world, you always get off of a plane and you're severely jet lagged, so this time it's been nice to not have any kind of sleeping in the daytime or being tired. So I kept the name that was given to this presentation because I kind of liked it. It's what I originally named, or it's what I described my kind of first data exploration piece. I thought about it as something in between kind of journalistic hacking mixed with political data. So I called it something like Mr. Robot meets House of Cards, which I put into my presentation as a logo, as you can see there. So I have the robot emoji with the American flag equals a playing card that's actually the Joker. So I thought it was a perfect description. So just to begin, a lot of my work is very visual. It's extremely difficult to put some of those visuals into a normal presentation. So I have a couple of links, and of course you can go after the presentation and you can view those links anytime that you like. I'll show a few of them, but in order to give kind of a coherent presentation, I'm going to base a lot of my discussion off of the slides I have here. So just to begin, because it's often discussed, when we talk about fake news is something that's not necessarily one object or one thing. And in fact, it's a very disputed term, and it's a term that's been used in a lot of different contexts. So I think the best way to describe fake news is to use the Fightclub analogy. There is really no such thing as fake news. There's a lot of different types of information that are provided or used in different ways for different purposes. And I think that the best way to frame fake news, in my opinion, even though it is a thing because it's been normalized to the point where it was recently put into the Associated Press stylebook. So here's the actual entry for fake news. So the AP says that you must use it in quotes, and you must use it as something that describes deliberate falsehoods or misleading statements. And they also have the internet on there, which I found interesting. So the AP describes fake news as something, in their formal definition in the stylebook, as something that comes kind of online rather than offline. So I find this quite interesting. So these types of things actually do normalize the use of fake news to a point, but they maintain that you should use it in quotation marks. So the work that I do on fake news primarily involves what I would define as propaganda, misinformation, and I think that there's a lot of satire and what are called hoaxes and parody sites and parody material that fall into the realm of disinformation and misinformation and propaganda, which I'll show a few of these. So I think a good way, the 3 Ds, as I say it, a good way to understand how fake news is used, they call it a weaponized term, so it's something that is often used in attacks. And I was describing in my panel yesterday, one of the evolutions that I've seen since I began studying this fake news phenomenon is the change from something that would come from content. So if people were calling stories fake news or an article fake news, and I've seen the evolution, or the escalation, I should say, of something that has transformed the use of fake news into something that is used for organizations. So now, not only are stories or articles called fake news, but now even in a press conference, like an official political press conference, a White House press conferences, organizations are actually called fake news. And there's kind of a famous moment. I think it's Jim Acosta for CNN is singled out by the president, and he says, "Your organization is fake news." So I think the use of that is quite interesting in terms of trying to discredit or devalue the legitimacy of all of the journalism that a major news organization like CNN does. And no one is perfect, obviously, but But when you weaponize the term for an entire organization, I think that's even more problematic than just using it for articles. So Claire Wardle from First Draft breaks down the 7 types of misinformation. I'm not going to cover that now because I'm not really focused on content at this point in time. So, but she does describe, a way to understand fake news is to break it down into kind of 3 things. And one of the things is the types of content being shared. The second is the motivations for those people who are the producers of the content and the people who are creating content for certain reasons and for certain purposes, which we'll talk about. And the third way, which is my main focus here, is how that content and how the material is being circulated and disseminated, especially online. And of course, I think it's important to point out nowadays that the distinction between online and offline is very blurred. What happens we don't really log off of Facebook anymore. We don't log off of social networking apps. Most people are connected, and especially most people with smartphones or devices. We don't really take time off of the internet. So these things are very mixed. So the distinction between offline and online is very blurred, and it's almost becoming one thing, a continuous cycle of exposure to information and exposure to constant news. So the third way is what I'm really focused on because I study the flows of information and because my work is looking at the system. So one of my reasons for the research that I started recently, the past year or so, has been that blame has been assigned to just certain actors or certain platforms. And I think, to some degree, that's unfair because the environment that we've created online is due to a lot of different reasons, and all of these systems work together. So I think it's very important that, even though parties may be guilty or parties may be involved in serving ads to people or serving certain types of content to certain populations, especially in the United States, which is happening exactly right at this moment where there's blame being assigned to Facebook, for example. I think that it's bigger than that. It's a bigger picture than that, and it takes a lot of different platforms. It takes search engines, it takes indexes, it takes our behaviors and the way that culture has developed online. All of this has come together to create the kind of larger problem of fake news. So I'm very interested in looking at the sources of information because not a lot of the content that comes through Facebook, a lot of these things are produced through WordPress sites, they're produced through blogs, they're produced in other places, not necessarily published directly through Facebook and on Facebook, although sometimes they are, which other people have studied, like Craig Silverman from BuzzFeed. So the flows of information are very important because the flows, if we can look and see if information is coming from a certain site, if it's moving through Twitter and Facebook and how it's moving and through which people it's moving, it's very important because it allows us to understand how this information is circulating and how maybe we could slow it down or at least get insight into understanding what effects a certain story or material that's circulating through news might have if it's targeting certain types of audiences, hate speech, for example, or resulting in certain kinds of behavior. So the relationships are very important between these different actors. So one of my first maps that I did, I'm going to try to, I'm just going to zoom out for 1 second here, was my first kind of dive into what I called the propaganda machine. So this is kind of one of my first maps of the ecosystem, and this doesn't have the links in between the different sites, but this was taken from a list of allegedly fake news sites, and most of them now, I think, on the list have been very much substantiated for the claims that they serve misinformation, they serve propaganda. Not all of them, but most. So, but when you look at these, the size of the circle or the size of the node actually shows you how large or how many links are coming into these sites from the collective group of quote-unquote fake news sites. So the first thing that kind of showed on this picture or suggested was YouTube. So YouTube is one of the kind of large sources of traffic coming in from these fake news sites. So these types of maps can kind of give us some insight into how which resources they're using, for example. So if you were to take more mainstream sites, you wouldn't see YouTube necessarily as kind of the center of their universe, because most of the content for New York Times or most of the content from larger media organizations, the video especially, will be served in-house. So if you look kind of deeper into each of these, you see very interesting patterns in how these things are used to promote and circulate certain types of content. So I'll just move this down just a little bit more to show one more. So if you look at the traffic, and I think that the last speaker before me was just kind of going into direct URL referrals, but it also suggests that, again, not all of this traffic is coming from Facebook. Not all of it is coming. There's very different methods used, and if you look at these, it's hard to show, which is exactly why I tried to avoid some of these data visualizations. But you can see that email is still playing a part, and email isn't the most amazing, newest technology, but it's still very powerful for pushing certain types of ideas. Often at people's places of employment, at their work, you can't get on Facebook, or Facebook can be blocked. So email is still a very powerful way to get out messages, and it's also a very powerful way to collect people's information, so then you can use their email address to target them directly on Facebook. If you can collect people's email address, you can input that directly into Facebook ads, and you can find those people, those individuals' real profile on Facebook. It's called custom audiences. So all of these things link together. Email is important. You see direct URL referrals into some of these fake news sites, which suggests that things like WhatsApp are possibly being used. Instant messaging groups are being used. So there's a lot more going on than just one platform. So I'll just show you with the links. It's the scary picture, as I call it. This displays all the links on here. The computer's actually having a little bit of a tough time. Can I zoom in? So this is kind of the same map, the network map, but what I did was I put the links in between the sites. So what this shows, YouTube is right here. So you very much see that these small sites that most people have never heard of are just almost spamming thousands of different URL links. But this works together to influence things like search ranking, right? All of these have effects in terms of a system. And again, when you see YouTube, you see Wikipedia on here, which suggests targets for how Wikipedia entries are being used and how Reddit and WikiLeaks come together to filter and trickle through information into sites like Wikipedia, which are used for fact checking, right? So I'll just go back to my presentation here. It's really hard to show those types of visuals on large screens, so I saved most of the visuals for later. So what my kind of initial work found was that a lot of the original material coming from these propaganda sites, these misinformation sites, these kind of almost borderline hate speech sites, are coming from very basic blogs. A lot of them are set up on old WordPress versions. Out-of-date WordPress. A lot of them are bought through these companies that will just set you up in 5 minutes with a website. Squarespace would be one of them. There's lots of WordPress. WordPress might be the most ubiquitous technology across this entire network. And this includes this whole ecosystem of fake news. Why is WordPress being used? Because you can scale it, because you can package it and bundle it into Amazon Web Services, and you can roll out thousands of WordPress sites at the same time. And from what I've seen so far, it suggests that these are automated, so that you can post 200 versions of a story, or you can post 200 articles across a range of different sites at the same time through a few kind of simple plugins on WordPress. So it makes sense, and WordPress is inexpensive, if not free in many cases. So I found these things interesting in terms of where the original articles come from, and what you see in Facebook is often coming from these sites. And those little red dots that were kind of spamming all of the red links in the last map, those are the kind of blogs and WordPress sites often that I'm talking about. Most of them are issue-driven. They're based on religion. They're based on immigration. So most of them are issue-focused. So the second factor in this, which I mentioned just a couple seconds ago, was email, text messaging, direct messaging, chat groups are all playing parts of these. Where platforms come in and how platforms are being used are for two reasons. Facebook and other sites are being used to find people, to find real-life people. So our identity exists online, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are, say, a voter or we are an active voter. So if we collect enough information on the web and enough information through email and other means, we can use that directly. We can just literally add it into an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Doc and find and upload that to Facebook for their kind of custom audiences tool or many other types of targeting. Facebook is not the only thing being used. So where Twitter seems to be used, and I think these themes they're big, but they're important. Twitter is used more to keep the media occupied and keep them busy, and often keep them distracted. So not a whole lot of people use Twitter that don't work in media or politics or government. I don't think it's not a mainstream platform. I mean, it's a big platform, but the use for propaganda and the use for fake news and misinformation is really directed at trends and setting the media agenda, which was extremely effective in the U.S. election. It was a kind of a showcase example of how you would use Twitter to keep people discussing whatever you wanted at the beginning of the day. So you get up at 4 a.m., you type a crazy tweet, it keeps the media busy all day long. They argue about it, there's talk shows about it. If you go into the transcripts, into some of these, from the text transcripts from a lot of the channels, what you'll find is the most mentioned entity outside of Fox News, for example, or CNN, is often Twitter. So it's unbelievable how effective like one tool can be used. And then search engines have the other kind of factor in here, because I think that search engines, especially autocomplete, have been targeted specifically because people go to search engines to seek truth. Like you go to Google to type in something if you don't understand exactly what it is or to find more information about it. So it's a very, very strategic point, if not at least as strategic as Facebook, to influence people's behavior and influence their mind, because it's our information portal. And Google isn't dominant in every single country, but I think for most of the world, it's fairly accurate to say Google plays a big part in how people understand truth and how people find more information about a given topic. Are there any alternatives? Are there any real alternatives? I don't know if there are. Other search engines do exist, but when you really need to find something, unfortunately, you have to. I mean, Google is the thing that you pretty much use because they have the best product. So going into this. I think that social media's given a lot of attention on this, but social media plays one role, but a lot of it is based on personalization. So I think that one of the things that I want to argue on this particular talk is that personalization and kind of real-time relevance have a lot to do with what has kind of taken place at the level of politics, especially in the United States. So I think that the algorithms that sort things, that filter, that recommend, that increasingly recommend that we take specific actions, which I'll show here. So, just as a researcher, I try to be very careful about which accounts I use to look at different content, because I don't want that content to follow me around if I'm looking at kind of bad things. But all it takes is just pausing on one piece of sponsored content or one promoted post on Facebook, and you end up with Milo in your newsfeed, essentially. So, and I mean, I never went to his page. All I did was slow down on one post that someone had commented on. That this wasn't even part of my social network, but these things enter through a lot of different ways, vectors of inserting kind of information. So again, this is said over and over again, but just reinforcing the fact that content is very much, especially political content, is very much issue-driven, and it's very much directed to kind of seek behaviors and responses in certain types of audiences. So this is the whole micro-targeting debate. So let's move on here. And again, this goes beyond the web as well. So there's a lot of talk about the web and the World Wide Web and websites, but apps have a huge role in this, right? So on the left, there's something called America First. It's hard to see on this because it's a big screen. So there's a whole range of apps that essentially are politically driven by the same company that are connected into Facebook that gamify recruiting your friends for causes. America First is kind of the main one, but they're all based on certain issues. So there's another one for gun rights, for the NRA. There's another one for Catholic, Catholic-driven issues that in politics. So all of these apps exist, and when you open it and you kind of go into the app, you'll see that you get points and you get rewarded for recruiting your friends into joining these groups on Facebook. Again, as soon as you join the group, you're able to be targeted into a custom audience on Facebook, because it's one of the ways that you can target audiences is through events and groups. And it also has all sorts of other social integration. It says follow these people on Twitter, do all these things, and you get rewards. So everything is ranked as well. So when any content is evaluated, especially on Instagram and Facebook, which are visual driven. But you can see this picture here. This is from a Facebook presentation about 8 months ago. But you can see that on the kind of top right corner, there's a score. So, and this is kind of this weight that comes in through Facebook's algorithm. So everything is given a numerical score. A like is weighted in terms of a numerical score. A comment is weighted. A comment, of course, has more impact than a like for promoting it through your social network. So it's an interesting new way of understanding media, I think. And news obviously is going to fall directly into this type of behavioral analysis. Everything that we use to share now is based on emotion. Most of our sharing tools are based specifically on emotion. So one of the things that I proposed actually to one of Facebook's people was why is it all angry or sad or happy? Could there be another emoji for trust? Could there be a trust emoji? I don't know what the actual emoji character would be, but these are interesting questions because everything is kind of driven through emotion, measured through attention, and I think this is the fundamental basis of a lot of the problems we have, is that it's based on reactions. So conspiracy, I need to move quickly here. Conspiracy sites are interesting in terms of the propaganda ecosystem, because over and over again, the types of social integration suggest, especially with the Facebook likes and the Facebook integrations into these sites, suggest specifically that these sites are not meant to share news. A lot of these fake news sites are actually meant to identify people and to gather certain types of behaviors and find groups of people who are susceptible to certain types of information and certain types of propaganda. So again, I use this example in a lot of presentations, but it's Secrets of the Fed. It's this conspiracy site about the Federal Reserve and the banking system. But I just don't think that someone's going to get on there that is actually a true believer in these conspiracies and like it on Facebook and share it across. It just doesn't make any sense that a true conspiracy theorist would never. I don't think they would go anywhere near some of these social networks. So the hoax is another interesting, a lot of these things suggest that the content, although it's not always 100% fake, a lot of it is set up specifically to elicit reactions from both sides, mostly in terms of awe, shock, or anger. And I think that Craig Silverman from BuzzFeed does make a good point when he says that a lot of stories that are 100% false are meant kind of to make money. A lot of the things that we need to worry about in politics are the stories that are not necessarily 100% false or 100% true, but the ones that mix or distort or frame the truth in certain ways that are problematic for the public. I'll move through. So biased headlines are another example of how these things kind of socially propagate, and this originates, this isn't a new problem. These things are, this comes from the clickbait atmosphere that we have that have kind of ruined a lot of the experience of just reading news online, because you have to click to see what the actual catch on the story is. So just to kind of start to wrap this up, a lot of fake news, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, is about data, and it's about data collection, and it's about profiling people. So news, in a way, is a vector. It's a tool, a means to an end, to find people. And what platforms, especially social networks, what they provide is not just ads. They're not just serving ads, but they actually, the main product of most social networks is people. So I think that it's very important to understand that it's not just display ads that are getting served out by certain countries, but it's actually their main product is selling identity. It's selling access to audiences. So from a journalist's perspective, I mean, I think that these things need to be considered. It's thinking more a little bit like advertising or a data scientist in a way, but for targeting and for audience analysis, you have to understand these kind of new rules. So algorithms, of course, can position people into certain groups and reinforce and kind of polarize how people understand and see an issue, whether news on it is necessarily true or false. I call it reaction trolling, is when these things come out and both sides have their take on it. No one really sits in the center or kind of waits to react to it, and things just kind of go downhill in terms of people agreeing or even choosing to disagree about certain issues. So one big difference in propaganda now and the kind of argument against how it's changed is that propaganda isn't leaflets. They're not throwing leaflets out of planes, hundreds of thousands. They're not putting up posters. So this isn't even direct mail that is going out to people's mailboxes. These things are very real time. They're very emotional, and they're very individually targeted. And this is going to be a problem for things like fact-checking, because in a year, 2 years, 3 years, very soon, what you're going to be dealing with is automated writing of stories. So when that happens, and they're already planning these types of things, is that you can write 100,000 different versions of a story and personalize it out to each person. So how do you fact-check 100,000 different versions of a story? And these things can be done at scale, and this is the whole problem. So I've called it micro-propaganda. Emphasizing one more thing is that, again, these things it's not always about true or false, and I talked about this on the panel yesterday, but most of it is about to confuse or just inject enough distortion or enough noise into the discussion that people don't really know what to believe. And I think that's a lot of the goal, especially in political journalism and political news, is that if you just inject a little bit of noise, people, you just kind of, you undermine the trust just enough that people won't feel comfortable really having an opinion, or maybe not voting for a certain person. Maybe it's not about voting for someone. Maybe it's more about keeping people from just voting, or making them kind of unhappy enough with a candidate that they don't vote at all, which I think was a big factor in the United States election. So outrage, not agreeing to disagree. So provoking certain types of emotions are just a huge part of the content. Again, a means to an end. A lot of this is to find people who are susceptible to influence from a political perspective. So algorithms help us separate fact from fiction. So these things are targets for fake news. When you write enough stories about something, when you have enough bots working on Twitter to make something trend, this does help set an agenda, and most of these things are done through algorithms, and humans are involved, but not necessarily at the exact moment in time when these things happen. So a lot of these things, the suggestions even for the ads on Facebook are often algorithmic. So these technologies are not transparent. We don't quite understand how these work. And I don't think the companies often do either, or some of the effects that these algorithms might have. So just to wrap this up, this isn't conspiracy talk. Even though there's a lot of unknowns, I think that there's important caveats. The things that have changed for the older idea of fake news and the newer idea of what I would call micro-propaganda are that for years we've given data to companies, to people, to platforms we're sharing. All the while, our technology gets more sophisticated at sharing things. So now we don't just share location, or we don't just share when we're checking our email, but now we're sharing, all of the phones now have motion coprocessors. So that means that a lot of apps can sense which way we're holding the phone, if we're holding it in front of our face, if we're laying in bed. So a lot of these apps are set specifically to collect information if we're holding our phone sideways, if we're holding it horizontally, if we're looking at it in bed, how bright our screen is, how close our face is. For the next phones, they're going to start to understand how we look at news, possibly. So the privacy issues are going to get more complicated. So, over years and over time, we've just given a lot of data to these companies. So the way they can profile us is much greater than it was even a couple of years ago, and much greater than 4 or 8 years ago. So the automated systems create fake humans in a way, or they create the illusion of support, and this is a big factor in legitimizing certain types of views and bringing things that probably should be kept suppressed in society, kind of bringing them to the surface, bringing certain types of hate speech, bringing behaviors that shouldn't normally be acceptable. A lot of these things are, can be helped through technology, through kind of bot accounts and through automation, through scaling. So I think this is a huge difference between old types of propaganda and kind of the old conception of fake news and what's happening now. The scale at which this is happening is just, it's unbelievable. And the kind of impact these can have, at least for now, on some of the trending algorithms and also on search engines like Google matter. Because some of these most influential automated accounts on Twitter do get indexed by Google. So they do have impact into things like search autocomplete. So not all of them, but some of the more influential ones. So the last one really is the kind of programmatic advertising, the retargeting. And this is the discussion that's happening right now with companies like Facebook. So the current tech is really more like, if you were to imagine that things could be customized before, but they were pushed out to people. So you would get a certain type of display ad, or you would get a certain type of Google AdWord with something that you're interested in. I think that the newer technology and advertising and even news content that's being promoted is more kind of an emotional pull rather than a push, if that makes any sense. I think that it's a grapple and it catches people. It's more of a magnet than something that kind of is delivered out to people. So simply because we, around politics, around cultural issues, they're very driven emotionally. They're very driven between groups and ideologies and cultures. So that is my end of my presentation, and I'm happy to talk more in the workshop. Thank you.